And that was it.
And then the 12th of April, of course, 6 weeks later, he died. This part of the picture I was able to obtain. It is from the Tehran conference 14 months before, October 1943. This is my boss, Arnold, General of the United States Air Force, who could not attend Yalta because of some disability. But he was at this is a picture of the president at Tehran in October of 1943. Look at the difference, the way he looked there and 14 or 15 months later. What a deterioration has taken place in his health. And he was quite a handsome man in those earlier days, I should say.
Now, there's a lot of statements that Stalin didn't live up to his promises. But what were his promises?
To any of them.
What were his promises?
Well, the first promise would be that he was going to order free elections in every one of the countries which they occupied. He knew very well that he wasn't going to keep that promise. He already had formed his policy of what he's going to do, of making them satellites, of making them completely put them under the Kremlin control. There was no question about it.
What condition was the Russian army at that time? Could they have held those countries if we hadn't given them to them?
Yes, they could have held the countries because those other countries didn't have anything, of course, to fight with and to drive out the Russians. But we committed, in my opinion, the biggest blunder we committed was in 1956. I fault President Eisenhower in that. In fact, even before then. We promised, our government promised to liberate all those countries under Soviet control. Here, the East Germans revolted in February of 1953. We did nothing about it. Again, in February of 1956, the Poles revolted. The Russians suppressed them. But the biggest revolt was in Hungary in November of 1956. And those Hungarian freedom fighters were very successful. They were about to take over that government completely when Andropov, who was then ambassador to Hungary, had brought in Soviet troops to suppress it. I have said this any number of times. These freedom fighters did not want any our soldiers. They did not want any military help. They wanted ammunition. They wanted military supplies. We could have set the communist world on fire had we come to the aid of the freedom fighters in Hungary. There would not have been probably a Soviet Russia today if we had done that, because that would have started the fire in every one of the countries, in Romania, in Czechoslovakia, in Bulgaria. Every one of them. In Yugoslavia was already half, you might say, free from Soviet control under Tito. But there's no question in my mind, but the fire would have started and would have probably spread into Russia proper.
Instead, 37 countries have fallen to Russia.
In that period of time, yes, since that time. That's right.
And all of them basically through the same
Very definitely,
approach.
yes, absolutely, yes.
One of the heartbreaking things that happened right after Yalta, and I'd like you to give me a couple of the things that happened, but was the return of all the Soviet Army members who found themselves in the West and then were shipped back to Russia, many of which committed suicide. Now, why didn't Roosevelt stop that?
That was another of our blunders. I call it a black page in American history, the so-called Clay-Sokolnikov Agreement. There were, I don't remember how many, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian Russians, and other, of course, other ethnic groups of Russia, who actually fought on the German side under General Vlasov, a Russian general, who were anti-communist. And of course, after the war, they were in concentration camps. I mean, in camps in that while Russia invaded, put them in concentration camps, and we agreed to send them back. And they were jumping out of cars, of the box cars.
They were committing suicide.
That's what they were doing, committing suicide. They knew what was going to happen to them. They were going to be sent to Siberia, and then the leaders would be executed. It's rather interesting to me that when I was a commander of the counterintelligence in Austria, in Salzburg in 1947, one of my captains, who knew that I spoke Russian very well, in one of my detachments, I had 8 detachments under my control, said, you know, I'd like to bring a couple of Russians, officers, to speak to you. I said, go and bring them. So he brought 3 Russian officers. And we were talking and discussing about their defection and why they were fighting on the German side. And then I said to them, I said, you know, you fellas really amaze me. I says, you were supposed to have been brainwashed. And here you were fighting against your own people practically. I says, on the side of the Germans. And one of them, they all kind of smiled, and one of them turned to me. He said, yes, Colonel, we were brainwashed on the outside, but not on the inside.
We have very little time left. You know, the Russian, several of their leaders have called American leaders as useful idiots that have played into the hands of Russian policy. What can we do to prevent that in the future? This tape is one of them, so we can have a historical perspective, which is a great blessing. We have 2 minutes. If you could say anything that we could do to keep from falling into the same trap again and again and again.
Well, what we need in this country is to go back to basic fundamentals of really actually starting in our schools, from which groups, of course, our future soldiers are going to be in the Army, whether it's going to be under universal military training or whether it's going to be under voluntary, to know better Russian history, and especially Russian history since the communists took over.
And our own history.
And our own history. We are not teaching them. I'll give you an interesting illustration of this thing.
Very brief. Very brief.
That the students in our schools, and I speak in our schools a lot, I speak in high schools, I speak in colleges, know so little about American history. They hardly know who our presidents are.
On that note, we're going to have to tell everybody out there that the students should learn American history, that we have to know, we have to be informed. My people perish for lack of knowledge, says God. So I hope that we're going to have the knowledge to be able to defend ourselves from becoming at least useful idiots. Colonel Mayton, thank you very much. You're a wise man. You've done great things. We appreciate having you here, and I appreciate all that you've shared with us. Thank you.
Glad to do so. Thank you.